I propose to take questions 3 to 8 together. I attended a special meeting of the European Council in Brussels on the 25th of November. At our meeting, we endorsed the withdrawal agreement and approved the political declaration. This was a positive step representing the culmination of over 20 months of difficult negotiations. The withdrawal agreement sets out the terms for the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. It ensures that the withdrawal will happen in an orderly manner, avoiding the United Kingdom crashing out with all of the severe consequences that would imply. It provides for a period of transition during which detailed negotiations on the future relationship between the EU and the UK can take place. It provides for the rights of UK nationals currently resident in other EU member states and EU citizens resident in the UK. It also provides for an orderly winding down of the current arrangements across a broad spectrum of EU cooperation and sets out the financial settlement and governance structures for withdrawal. The protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is an integral and fully legally operational part of the withdrawal agreement, fully protects the Good Friday Agreement and the peace. It translates the commitment to avoiding a hard border into a legal guarantee. As I've said many times, I hope that the backstop will never be needed, but it is vital that the withdrawal agreement contains this essential insurance policy, this fallback option should other options fail. The protocol also contains provisions on other important areas for Ireland, including the maintenance of the common travel area and all the rights and freedoms and benefits for citizens that flow from that. North-South cooperation, the single electricity market on the island of Ireland. It also ensures that there will be no diminution of rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity as set out in the Good Friday Agreement, and confirms that the people in the North will continue to enjoy rights as EU citizens, as I explained earlier. Importantly for Northern Ireland and also the border counties, it confirms that peace and Interreg funding will continue. I had no formal bilateral meetings in Brussels on the 25th of November, but did of course engage en marge with many of my EU counterparts, including Chancellor Merkel, as well as President Tusk and President Juncker, and of course Prime Minister May. I also spoke with President Juncker by phone on Friday the 23rd of November, 2 days before the summit. I thanked him for the continued solidarity and the work of the Commission, and I gave assent to the course of action which he proposed.
Ceann Comhairle, there is no Brexit outcome that will be good for Ireland or indeed good for the EU. That said, I welcome the withdrawal agreement ratified in Brussels. It represents the best way forward from the point of view of avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland and for protecting the Good Friday Agreement. I also welcome the unfailing support for the Irish position shown by the other 26 EU states. So a vote takes place in the House of Commons on December the 11th. I'm conscious that we shouldn't say anything on this side of the water to interfere in that process. I guess, Taoiseach, you don't want to say anything about the legal advice just published the legal advice to the UK government in relation to the Brexit deal. But that said, I think we are in for a period of uncertainty. It is clear that there is no plan B under consideration. So uncertainty prevails, and it would seem that we're in for a rocky road ahead, or we certainly could be anyway. Taoiseach, are we prepared for Brexit at this stage? Are we prepared for all eventualities and scenarios? Are we upgrading our ports and airports? Are we providing sufficient supports to businesses and SMEs to be Brexit ready? And just finally, Taoiseach, we now have the withdrawal agreement, and obviously then the future relationship will have to be negotiated. Is Ireland now actively engaged in preparing for these new negotiations in relation to the future relationship? You know, what work has been done on that regard in the context of working with the European Commission?
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Joan Burton.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. I'm conscious of the fact that yesterday, in the discussions in the British Parliament, that Mrs May referenced her view that the backstop would have to be short-term, and she actually said that, in fact, the EU would not allow it to remain for long, if you like, because it was something that the EU would not want the UK to have access to British markets, the UK to have access to EU markets for an indeterminate period of time. Now, I think that explanation by Mrs May, notwithstanding the enormous amount of support we've received from other EU member countries, has to be of concern to us in the context that if the backstop were to disappear, as people like the DUP would like, it would leave us very exposed if there were not alternative arrangements, both the North and the South. So I'm wondering in that context if you have had any opportunities to discuss what might happen. I do think the opinion of the Advocate General is to the European Court is possibly very helpful to us, but it seems to me that Mrs May is now being boxed into a corner where she is absolutely offering a fairly quick withdrawal from the backstop, not clear about what the alternatives might be, and the implications for the North as well as for the South are pretty, worrying.
Thank you. Deputy Eamon Ryan.
Indeed, it's impossible, Taoiseach, to work out obviously what's going to happen with regard to Brexit following the vote next week in the House of Commons. I was in Westminster myself last week talking to my colleague Caroline Lucas from the Green Party, who is involved in the People's Vote campaign, and we very much support that while being respectful from a distance. I don't believe that there can or should be any reopening of the deal that's on offer, but there's one variation I wanted to put to you as a possible further addition to what is available or what's possible that you might consider. I suppose it's in relation to the Advocate General's advice yesterday that it is possible to stall Article 50, but one other alternative, if it becomes useful to use it, is to offer a backstop guarantee for the UK itself in this way, in that should at the end of a transition period the UK decide at any stage to rejoin the European Union, that we would commit or try and get agreement among the European Union Council for that to happen without the usual strictures around having to join the currency, having to change your voting system or any of the other measures, to give the UK a backstop guarantee that if at the end of the transition period it's not working out, they can rejoin easily, quickly, at no cost. And I think that might give them a bit of space, or a bit of that might help the political situation. Lord knows how it will evolve in the next few weeks, but that as one of the options may possibly be of help. Would you consider that? Would you share it with your European colleagues and consider putting forward, if it needs be, within the coming weeks?
Can I just say, Ceann Comhairle, and just to place on the record my agreement with Deputy Boyd Barrett in respect of PIP and the universal credit. They have been hugely damaging to working and to vulnerable people. And just remind the Deputy that, believe it or not, this scenario would have been far worse, but for mitigation that was secured. It's not to defend them, but it is a function of ongoing British jurisdiction and the fact that the Tories are in government. I don't think we should make the mistake of going down the line of imagining, as Deputy Burton has, that the backstop disappears. The backstop won't be disappearing. The backstop, it is clear to me from the legal advice that has been provided, stays in place unless and until. So we shouldn't be getting into a false discussion or giving succour to those who would wish to ditch the backstop. No backstop, no withdrawal agreement. Sine, that's been enunciated clearly, and that line has been held. The only circumstances in which we don't have a backstop is, of course, in the event of a crash. And whereas there is no majority for that, you still cannot discount that might happen. So I want to put it to you, Taoiseach, more for you to have it in your line of thought rather than anything else. In addition to preparation for Brexit and the immediacy of it, we need to be mindful that in the event of a crash, no hardening of the border would be tolerable. We can't philosophically sit back and just absorb the damage that would incur. And in those circumstances, we have to look to the scenario of removing the border. And that is to say, a border poll, a referendum, and to putting the constitutional question. And I think it's important that government has that in its line of sight also.
Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Well, just to respond briefly to that point, yes, I'm glad, Deputy McDonald, you accept it. These are obnoxious so-called reforms. They're vile intrusions on people, cuts on people, very vulnerable people. But to my mind, they have to be resisted full stop. And I don't think mitigation is enough. This is just appalling. Private companies who are not even medical practitioners telling people whether or not they're entitled to disability supports. It's disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. And so a lesson that we mustn't go down that road, except Deputy Burton hasn't happened here yet, but let's not allow it to happen. But I do believe Sinn Féin shouldn't have passed that bill. And this is the point about whether Stormont is in place or not. We have to resist this stuff, regardless of who's in government or what administration is there, because it is vile, obnoxious stuff. It's not welfare reform. It is an assault on the most vulnerable people in society. Just one brief thing, about issues that get obscured by all of this, Taoiseach. Given the, I asked about this yesterday, given the Yellow Jackets protest, which I think is an absolutely justified protest against fuel hikes in France, to what extent are you discussing with your European colleagues the whole question of, yes, we need absolutely urgent, radical action on climate change, but we also have to ensure that that action is not one that hits at vulnerable, low-income people, but is actually directed at the big polluters, the fossil fuel industry, and so on. And indeed, I would just say, in brief conclusion, Count Corla, to me, it runs against what we're trying to do, to allow public transport fares in this country to increase at a time when we need to get people out of their cars and into public transport.
Deputy Martin.
I think to be achieved by trying to discern any final outcome from the chaos in Westminster at the moment. There are many different groups and constantly shifting coalitions. So, for example, the vote yesterday, it's very interesting, on the Grieve Amendment, Dominic Grieve Amendment, which saw Euro-positive Tory MPs, who will mostly support the deal, vote with the opposition, while the deal's most bitter opponents actually supported the government. The week's events, I think, raise very serious issues. I think the Keir Starmer parliamentary manoeuvres as well, in terms of forcing the publication of the Attorney General's advice, in many ways illustrates the strength of the British Parliament in terms of its parliamentary tradition, its power to vis-à-vis the executive, and something we might look at here. And I would put it to the Taoiseach that the British AG, Attorney General's, or the equivalent, the advice is now published, as we know, and I think we're waiting for the European legal advice sometime in the next while. Should not our own Attorney General's advice be published, given the unique circumstances governing this issue? It's a very, very serious issue for all concerned. I think you indicated to me that there would be the EU's legal service would make a statement sometime in the future about the implications of the withdrawal treaty, the legal implications. I think it might be useful if we had our own. I do accept that, and as the British Advocate General's point, that there's the political dimension, there's the legal dimension. And he was making the point that the backstop can never be permanent, while at the same time he's saying they could be trapped because of EU laws and so on like that. But he then makes the strong point, politically there will be a desire to have an agreement, and we should look at the positive side of that. But nonetheless, I think it would be helpful if we reflect on what's happening in Westminster in terms of the power of Parliament there, and compare it to what's happening in this Parliament in terms of access to important advice.
Now, Taoiseach, you have 29 seconds to respond to all.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Deputy Martin, if the UK Parliament is an example we want to follow, given the chaos that we're seeing, given the chaos that we're seeing in Westminster, and the agreement that we have took 18 months to negotiate. It's 500 pages long. 28 governments agreed to it, and this suggestion that somehow, if it's defeated, we would find ourselves negotiating with a parliament really is quite unworkable. To see a parliamentary delegation entering the tunnel to reopen the talks, it's just not something that's feasible. I appreciate you didn't say it, but that's how some people could interpret one of the motions that was passed yesterday, and it is my strong view when it comes to legal advice from the AG that legal advice should be privileged, and that's the case with lots of people's legal advice, so it should be privileged to those who receive it. I think Deputy Haughey asked about also asked about legal advice and the legal advice of the UK AG, and like I say, I'm not in a position to comment on it, as I've been here for 2 hours and has only been published in the last 2 hours, but I hope to get a chance to read it tonight at some time. But I doubt it's going to be fundamentally different from what he outlined in the House of Commons the other day, and has been the case for us. We did it on the 8th Amendment. We are willing to produce summaries of the AG's legal advice, and that's what he did, and it sounded sound to me, so it'll be interesting to see if there is any significant or meaningful difference between what he did release and what does come out today, but we'll see that when we see it. Deputy Haughey also asked if we're actively preparing for the future relationship talks, and the answer is yes. In fact, we used the opportunity of the summit in Brussels to do a round of the 27 Prime Ministers and Presidents for us to express what our priorities and particular interests and concerns would be for that future relationship. And as you can imagine, they're all the ones you would expect. People wanting there to be free trade and frictionless trade with the UK in the future relationship, but people also wanting to make sure that that's linked to a level playing field on environmental standards, labour rights, worker rights, all of those things. A particular concern around fisheries, and a lot of coastal states, including Ireland, are very concerned about what the impact could be on our fisheries industry. And as somebody who hails from a seafaring background and seafaring family, I know you'll have a particular interest in that too, and in guarding the interests of our fishermen who take a lot of their most valuable catches, mackerel and shrimp in particular, prawns from UK waters. So that work is already underway, and a lot of people as well were expressing the view that given that the Barnier Task Force model had worked very well as the agent negotiating for 28 member states, should we have a similar model for the future relationship treaty talks? It may not be Michel Barnier himself, but that model of a task force representing the 28 member states and the institutions, rather than the alternative, which might be the Commission, Council, different DGs trying to do different bits of the negotiation. The task force model seems to have worked very successfully in my view. I think Deputy Ryan was asking about the views of Scotland and Wales, of First Minister Jones and First Minister Sturgeon, and yeah, we did discuss the backstop, and they gave their views on it. It is of course important to bear in mind where they're both coming from. They both voted Remain. They would both still like the United Kingdom to remain in the EU, but both know that that's probably impractical at this stage. And they both have a particular perspective on the backstop, which is one that you don't hear here so much, but you do hear in the UK, is there is a concern by First Minister Sturgeon and by First Minister Jones that the backstop actually confers an advantage economically in Northern Ireland, confers an economic advantage on Northern Ireland business and Northern Ireland exporters that would put them at an advantage over Scotland, would put them at an advantage over Wales, and indeed even the possibility that you would see trade being diverted from the Dublin Holyhead route to Lawrence-Stranraer, for example. And I guess that is one of the reasons why Northern Ireland business has come out in favour of the backstop, because actually they see that what we've negotiated could be of economic benefit to Northern Ireland in terms of jobs and the economy and living standards. I think that's always an interesting perspective to get from other people. Deputy Ryan also asked about the possibility of a kind of a rejoin provision, which would allow the UK to rejoin the European Union on the same terms as it has now. And while that would have been worthy of consideration at the time, the UK didn't want that. Because as far as the UK government was concerned, this was the withdrawal treaty, they were leaving, they're not coming back, and they didn't want to entertain discussion on a rejoin provision. But there were mixed views on it at European level, because there are other European states. I don't take this view. If the UK ever decided to rejoin, I would celebrate that and welcome them as you would an old friend coming home. But some other EU countries would have a different view. They would feel that the UK already has special treatment, a rebate that other countries don't get, an opt-out from the euro, all sorts of opt-outs in relation to home and justice affairs. And a lot of countries would take the view that if the UK decides to stay, it should decide to stay this time and not be opting out of various aspects.
Thank you, Taoiseach. That concludes questions to the Taoiseach.